Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for doctors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medico-legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. Welcome to this podcast on starting out as a house surgeon. This is an exciting time, and we thought we would put together some suggestions for you to consider. My name is Chow Yen Chen, and I am a medico-legal consultant at MPS and an anaesthetist for Te Whatu Ora. I'm very lucky to have with me Dr. Tim Cookson, fellow MLC and GP.
Hi, Chow Yen.
Hello, Tim. We're also fortunate to be joined by Adam Holloway, who is one of the partners at our panel law firm, Watankani. Hello, Adam.
Hi, Chow Yen.
So starting on any new job is exciting and daunting. I know it was for me. Our hospitals are complex and they all have their own security systems and complex processes. Everything we talk about today we have been contacted about either through complaints via the hospital or the HDC, or have been examined via coronial processes or via complaints to the Privacy Commissioner. So, going back to the very beginning, hopefully you've already worked at your new hospital. But if you haven't, things like knowing how you'll get to work, where you will park, having your security access and computer access organised before your first day will all really help. Some hospitals have a formal orientation where you're not expected to be working, but in my experience, that first day is a working day for most hospitals, and changeover is immediate and you start work and you're expected to be part of the team. So if you've been a trainee intern at the hospital, this transition will be easier. If you're new to the hospital, you may like to consider taking some time in the previous weeks to go visit the team you'll be working with, if at all possible. Sometimes this is not possible, like if you're working in Dunedin as a TI but going to Auckland to start as a house surgeon. But bear in mind, this doesn't have to be a long visit, but I think it will be really worthwhile. So we all work in a medico-legal framework, and in clinical medicine, documentation is very important. In the role of the house surgeon, you're often recording the ward round and documenting the management plan, which is really important. For example, if a patient raises concerns that during their admission they reported pain, but were not given analgesia and no one listened to them, and you documented in the ward round notes that they reported pain in X area and the team prescribed X analgesia, then this will really help your team respond to the complaint. Also, documenting in an objective fashion on the care provided by your team is essential, because we've all had cases where specialty teams have been inadvertently critical of the care provided by another clinician, and the patients remembered this and they've been upset in some way during their hospital stay, and this has led to a complaint. Tim, can you think of a case where clinical documentation have really affected how a case has turned out?
Yes, well, I can think of one exactly on the lines that you've just talked about, where the consultant made a statement which really was critical of another clinician, and the house surgeon just recorded that word for word almost, without thinking about the potential medico-legal implications of that. And then when the patient saw the notes, they were very unhappy about that because actually they hadn't had good care from the team that wrote the notes, but they had good care from the other clinician who had been criticised. So they were doubly upset about it. So yes, there are things that you want to be very careful about recording. And I think if you've got any doubts, check immediately with your consultant. Do you want me to record that or not? The notes, the general rule is that in a medico-legal sense, if it's not in the notes, it didn't happen. But on the other hand, you can't write War and Peace for every single ward round that you go on. So, some discretion has to occur in terms of what you write down. The key is obviously to write down all the significant positive points, but I'm dealing with a case at the moment where a doctor, in this case a GP, not a house surgeon, was criticised significantly by the HDC, the Health and Disability Commissioner, for not recording that the patient had declined at that time to have a mammogram. This was in someone who presented with lumps in the neck. Other investigations were agreed to and were undertaken, but the Commissioner was critical of that omission. We've argued against that, but that's the ruling from the HDC. And certainly we've had cases where having good documentation really has made a huge difference for the practitioner. I remember one case where, again, a GP on this occasion hadn't written particularly good notes, but the notes that went to the HDC and were reviewed by the expert or the advisor showed that all of the previous notes were really good notes. And so he formed the view that, in fact, although it hadn't been recorded the specifics of that discussion that the patient was upset about in the final set of notes, because the previous lot of notes were so good, that he preferred the practitioner's version to the patient's version, which is uncommon. And so that was only because of the degree of detail that had been in the notes previously that saved him. So, yep, good notes is just critical. And of course, for a house surgeon, you're actually representing the team when you're recording that information. And so if a complaint does occur, your consultant may well be writing the response based on the notes that you've recorded at that time.
Yeah, that's right. Very important. And also need to keep in mind that patients do have a right to access those notes. So always write them as if the patient's going to read them. Yeah, so going along those lines of privacy and access to notes, I used to hold a list of all my patients for the team and what investigations or management they needed and that I needed to order. And I've certainly had calls from house surgeons who've gone home after a tiring day and they've left their patient lists on top of their cars and driven off, and it's now spread along the motorway, or they've had their bag stolen from their car and had all the patient health information in it, and that's now no longer secure. So privacy is a consideration in these situations. What would your advice be, Adam, for these issues where the health information is no longer secure?
I guess the first piece of advice I'd have for a house surgeon is not to try and deal with the situation in isolation. When you're starting a new job and you're unfamiliar with the people around you or the systems, I'm sure it can get overwhelming. And if you feel like you've made a terrible mistake, there must be at least a temptation to put your head in the sand or hope that nothing comes of it. I think that's the wrong way to deal with it. You need to let other people know what's happened. A situation like the one Chow Yen described, where there has been patient information that's been lost, I would be calling MPS. That's what your membership is for, and you'll get good advice around that. But I think inevitably there'll also be a process that needs to happen of letting the hospital know so that they can respond as well. And a lot of that's just around, practical things like making sure there's precisely what's been lost has been captured. So you know what's missing, you know who the patients are who might be impacted. But you can also use that information to take a view that actually the harm that might be caused is quite slight if it's just a list of patient initials and the abbreviations you use when you're trying to keep a note of everything that's happened on that shift. So do share your problems. People can take over and they can think about important legal issues like whether the threshold's been reached for needing to notify the Privacy Commissioner, whether the threshold's been reached for needing to notify those patients. You shouldn't have to ever be in a position of making those sorts of judgment calls on your own. They are legal issues, and there are people both at MPS but also in the hospital who are paid to help make those decisions and sort out problems like that when they arise, because they will from time to time.
Yeah, that's right. And I know that a lot of hospitals now have a patient confidential bin on the way out that you can walk past and put such patient lists into to prevent you taking them home and leading to privacy breaches potentially.
Yeah, and look, I am married to someone who was a house surgeon once, but that was a long time ago. I imagine these days people might be more used to using phones and things to capture that sort of information. So you need to be thinking about, does the hospital have a policy around that? Is it okay to use my phone? If it is, you still need to have good habits around deleting information, deleting WhatsApp conversations that are historic because you're off that shift. If you've got a memo open on your phone and you've been noting stuff down, that goes into the patient notes and is deleted off your phone in a timely way.
That's great. Yeah. So speaking of privacy, let's say that you're talking to a patient about their diagnosis and then they say to you that they don't want their diagnosis to go on their discharge summary. They don't want it to go to their GP. What would you say to this patient, Tim?
Yes, this is a particularly challenging issue, and there are two parts to this, actually. So first of all is the question of whether the diagnosis goes onto the discharge summary. Well, the diagnosis has to be in the notes somewhere, because if it really was a diagnosis, then it's critical that is part of the health record. And patients, although they may object to that, they have no rights to have that information not recorded on the notes. They may object to other things that you've written, and sometimes information needs to be removed that is not accurate. But if a diagnosis has been reached, then that is part of the health record. The next bit is what information goes to the GP, because in fact patients do have the absolute right to say, no, I don't want this information to go to anyone else. But the problem there is that this could be an important diagnosis, and if the GP is not aware of that diagnosis and then proceeds to treat something else on the basis of not understanding or not knowing, then the patient's health can suffer as a result. So you've got a real dilemma there. And I think this is the kind of thing where actually you need to call in the cavalry and say, look, I understand your position. I'm going to get my consultant to come and have a chat to you about that, just so that you fully understand what the implications might be for you if your GP doesn't have that information.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's totally right, is to work with your team and get support when you need it if you've got any questions. Going back a step, when Adam talked about hospital policies and managing information digitally in a safe fashion, one thing to be really mindful of is that you should only be accessing information for patients that you're providing care for. Because we've had doctors reported to medical council for accessing information from members of the public that they're not providing care for. And all these clinical portals are audited. So if you're picked up, it becomes really hard to explain why you were looking up X's results when you weren't providing care. And from the Privacy Commissioner, we know that employee browsing is a big problem, and they get lots of reports about privacy breaches.
It's just such an open and shut case that you will get in trouble for, not only potentially from your employer, because looking at the notes for someone who you're not providing care for will certainly be in breach of workplace policies. So there might be an employment consequence. It will also get reported to the Privacy Commissioner and probably to the Medical Council. So it's a lot of attention that you will be subject to for that. And as Chow Yin said, it's become so much easier these days to have the IT departments employ tools and what have you to just see, who they run periodic tests on these systems. Has there been an instance of patient notes being viewed by someone who's not on that team or not in that department? So you can get picked up simply through people running these sorts of tests from time to time and called into a meeting to explain yourself, and there really isn't any explanation for that that you could give.
I had a case where a doctor was picked up for accessing his wife's results in the hospital, and she'd actually asked him, so there was full consent for him to get that information. So he wasn't breaching privacy in that instance, but he was breaching hospital policy. And so he got into trouble from an employment point of view, not from a medico-legal point of view for doing that access.
Yeah, I think it's really, it just gets you in hot water. Like you say, we've had members who have looked up potential love interests, and it's just so hard to explain.
Yeah.
So hard to explain. So jumping around a little bit, we're going to go back to the ward round and think about all these investigations that you're being asked to order and the results you're chasing. What if you miss something? What do you think would happen? What do you think, Adam? Whose responsibility is it if you order the test and the whole team misses the result?
Yeah, look, a similar answer, Chao-Yen, to the one I gave before, which is don't let it be only your problem in isolation. If a result's been missed and you've discovered that subsequently, the first and most important thing is to focus on the clinical care that's being provided. Whoever's responsible for coming up with the plan for that patient needs to know about the results. So tell your registrar, tell the consultant, let people know what's happened. You use the word Chao-Yen team, and it is a team sport. So even if you have made an error yourself because you were unfamiliar with the system or you didn't know where to look for that result, it's not going to be only your problem. And that's another good reason for immediately saying, look, this thing's happened, we need to sort it out. If a complaint were made to the HDC, in all likelihood, responsibility would probably lie at the higher level for those who are supervising you rather than you individually. You might be asked to give a response to the Health and Disability Commissioner and explain what happened from your perspective, but the system's usually pretty good at protecting junior doctors from carrying the can for the sorts of day-to-day slips that do happen in teams. But the reason there is that team approach and there is someone at the top who holds responsibility is because they ultimately have the job of running a system or running a team that avoids those mistakes from happening, either through appropriate training, appropriately familiarizing you with the systems you'll be using. So don't feel scared of what's happened, and make sure you put the patient first would be my advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a practical perspective, it might feel like you do this ward round, you're given a whole list of jobs, and then everyone disappears at the end of the ward round. So who are you going to ask? Because your consultants and registrars have got patients to review, clinic and theatre and operating work. So they've got other jobs to get on with, and you might have all these questions and not know how to approach them. So one option to consider is that you ask them at the end of the ward round, if I've got questions, how can I find you? How would you like to be contacted? If you're on a surgical run, it's always a good idea to come down to theatre, because the surgeons always hassle the anaesthetists and say there's compulsory anaesthetic muck around time, although they're a bit more brutal with that phrase. And there's always downtime between cases, so you can talk to your registrars and consultants. If you're on a medical run and your registrars and consultants are busy seeing patients, again, collate your questions, go talk to them. Because if they're on the phone consulting and you phone them and they don't have the opportunity to answer, it can add to their mental load. So if you go see them, it can add to your learning and give you a chance to clarify your questions. So if you're asked to do something that you haven't done before or you're uncomfortable doing, for example, consenting a patient for a surgical procedure, you're not sure what to do, can you think of any pointers for our new house surgeon? Any ideas about what you might be able to, any help that you could get?
Well, I guess the key is that you can't consent someone to a procedure unless you have a really good understanding of what the procedure involves, what the risks are, as well as the likely benefits. So, at the early part of a run, then actually you're going to need to be observing someone else doing the consent until you've got sufficient information to be able to do that. As the run goes on, you might have more confidence to be able to be involved in a patient giving informed consent for relatively simple procedures. But if there's anything that you're feeling uncomfortable with, consent is one of the issues that the HDC is really focusing on at the moment. And so the last thing you want to be doing is kind of pretending that you know what you need to know, or kind of fudging questions from the patient because you don't have all the information to be able to answer it. And I think in those circumstances, you just need to say, oh, look, I'll need to get someone to talk to you who can answer those questions because I don't have sufficient knowledge about it. My house surgeon days were a long, long time ago, but I remember frequently getting patients to sign consent forms for operations that I had no idea what they were about. Fortunately, things have changed a lot since then, and it's much better these days. But it does create an onus on whoever's part of that consent process to ensure that they have all the information that they need to be able to fully inform a patient and get fully informed consent.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's a really good idea, even once you feel comfortable gaining consent. If the patient has any queries, to simply say, oh, I'll get the registrar doing the procedure, or I'll get the consultant doing the procedure to come talk to you as well. One option could be that you write out the consent with what you're going to discuss with the patient, and have your registrar or your consultant look over that to check if you've missed anything, or get one of them to come with you to observe your consent process. And that way they're on hand if the patient has questions as well. And similarly, if you're being asked to request medical imaging, for example, radiology requests, it might really feel like you're going to talk to the radiologist to sell them the case, to try and get a scan or an MRI. But again, talking to your registrars and consultants to work out why it is they're wanting the scan really helps with that process, because it gives the radiologist information to determine what's appropriate in the investigation. And putting that appropriate information on the request form is also really important, because we have had HDC cases where inadequate clinical information is being provided to the radiologist, and therefore they haven't interpreted the scan in the correct clinical context. Can you think of misreporting or issues that's arisen from that scenario, Tim?
Absolutely, and it's not just radiology requests. It could be requests for pathology report, and I'm assisting a doctor at the moment who the changes that were on the pathology slide were pretty subtle and were missed by the pathologist on the first reading. And in fact, when the pathologist shared it with a number of colleagues blindly, about 50% of them missed the finding. But critically, the information that had been provided with the request form wasn't the full information, wasn't the full clinical information. And if that had been provided, the pathologist would have looked much, much more carefully for the changes that were eventually found. So, having the information there is critical. Even with microbiology,
Yes.
really important for that as well, for the context. So, you're sending a sample off, but you omit to say that this patient has just returned from overseas. And that changes completely the context in which a microbiologist might be looking for the things they look for.
Yeah, absolutely. Providing as much information as you can is really helpful and protective. And also another area that we're going to talk about is prescribing. Lots of hospitals now have e-prescribing that have inbuilt checks to prevent errors in prescribing. But also don't hesitate to check with your colleagues if you're unsure. I know I still check with my surgical colleagues if they're asking me to administer a medication in theatre that I'm not familiar with, because I might not know the indication that they want it for. So if in doubt, it's really useful to ask, because once you prescribe that medication, you are responsible for its use. So ask if you've got doubts. The hospital pharmacists are very knowledgeable and very helpful with potential drug interactions in polypharmacy. Something that you might want to consider while starting out is that medicines you might be commonly asked to prescribe include antiemetics and analgesia. So it might be useful to familiarise yourself with these.
Certainly medication is one of the prime areas that the HDC gets involved with, and errors are a common theme with the HDC. And I've had a case in the days when things were still being written by hand as to whether the decimal point was visible or not.
Oh, yes.
On
the decimal point.
Yep, because that makes a big difference. Is
Yes.
it 10 or 1,
Yeah.
The patient did have an adverse outcome, and it was because the wrong dose had been given, but the wrong dose had only been given because it wasn't clear on the form.
Yeah. So Adam's mentioned a few times, and Tim's also alluded to, it is a team. You're working as a team. So always ask, but what happens if your team's not supportive, or if you feel like you've got no one to ask? Do you have any suggestions for our house surgeon in that situation?
Your thoughts, Adam?
Look, it's hard. It's similar to many workplaces, really, where if you're starting out but having difficulties with the people who are managing you or who you report to, that's a really, really tricky situation to be in. Probably starting as a house surgeon, that's elevated by the degree of responsibility that you have. Because you are part of a team, but often your part of that process of providing care will be really important. So you need to know you're getting it right. I guess that leads me on to say is don't leave it unaddressed, but nor would I rush at it like a bull at a gate, because maintaining relationships in the hospital will always be important. Sometimes that requires a little bit of compromise. You don't want to immediately be the person who's coming into a system, still really learning what it's like, but having very stridently expressed views about what you expect the team to be giving you. So it's a sensitive thing to talk about. I'm not suggesting that people should harden up or ignore problems, but it is a new environment, and you don't want to be erode those relationships while you're still building them. So move cautiously, but let people know. Say, well, look, I'm just looking for a bit more help here. Is there another person I could talk to? I'm finding it difficult getting time with you, and I appreciate you're busy. Is there someone else I could talk to? Can we make a particular time each day where you're going to be, at your computer where I can pop in if I've got a question? If things get elevated, You can access HR resources in the hospital. But remember, these are the people you're going to be working with, and you've got a long career in medicine ahead of you. You're not always going to be head over heels about everyone you're working with, but you have to make it work, and it has to be safe. And if you're not getting the information or resources you need to play a safe part of that team, then you can't ignore the problem either.
Yeah. And those first few weeks will be difficult, and there will be challenges. And you can consider like having a buddy, an older house surgeon, someone more experienced, someone you got on with as a TI. Have a friend you can message just to talk about or bounce ideas off. Because there's going to be lots of new situations. Even I remember when I was making, as a house surgeon, when I was making a referral to another specialty, I found that really daunting. I would gather all my notes and sit and have volumes and volumes of notes and all the results in front of me, because I felt like I needed to answer every question that they might be able to ask. And they never did. They were often just, okay, I'll put them down. But I think what really helps in that situation is to have seen the patient. If you've seen the patient, talked to them, done an examination, then even if you can't answer all their questions, then at least you know the person in front of you who you're referring. And that really helps, because we're all busy. All the registrars and consultants you're referring to are very busy. But if they can get a sense that you've taken the time to see the patient and get to know them a little bit, then that will help in your referral process and help you communicate. So another thing we're going to talk about is, once we've seen a patient, you've looked after them, cared for them during their admission, and then you're going to discharge them. On your discharge summary, there's inevitably follow-up tests or some other images that you want for the patient, or you're going to refer them to another specialty. And when I was a house surgeon, it was always tempting to put GP review on discharge, but provide no other information for the poor GP. So I think that makes it really difficult for the GP when they've got all these other patients, and then this person comes and they don't have a discharge summary with them always, and you might not have received one from the hospital. So what would your advice be?
This is an area that certainly riles GP as a whole community, and that phrase "GP to follow up" or "GP to chase results" is one that I would caution all house surgeons never to put on their discharge summaries. I think one of the issues is that you kind of, as a house surgeon, you're thinking, this is a discharge, this person is going. It's actually more useful to think of it as a handover rather than a discharge. And you think of what you would do in a hospital setting if you're handing over, say, from a surgical team to the medical team. You'd provide them a lot of information, and that's on the discharge summary, but you'd also make sure that the medical team understood and knew what the plan was going to be, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what's missing in a discharge summary, is the checks. And as a GP, I always really appreciated it if I had a ring from the house surgeon who said, look, there's a couple of things that we haven't been able to finalise. Are you okay about checking those? That's a handover. I was always happy to do it, and that's great. Because the problem for GPs is often the information that is missing won't come to us. It might be an X-ray that hasn't been fully reported yet, but the result won't come to the GP. So I'm expected to ring the hospital to find that result. That's clearly not practicable in today's world. So I think just changing the emphasis and thinking of it as a handover, and if there's anything really important that is critical for the next doctor who's going to be caring for that patient, which is the GP, to know and for you to be sure that they know, then getting on the phone or having some kind of to and fro communication that enables you to be sure that, yes, this doctor who's going to be taking over the care knows what's needed and has agreed to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we certainly do see cases where what's being complained about arises from that discharge moment or the transfer moment between a hospital and a GP, or potentially there might be multiple services. So you're seeing someone in Palmerston North, they're going back to their GP, but the next person who's going to see them might be a tertiary service provided in Wellington. The health system can be incredibly complex. Bits of it aren't always visible to all the other bits.
Yeah.
GPs won't always necessarily have perfect access to results and information. I like the word plan that Tim used. I think in the cases that I've assisted with, making sure that that moment of discharge is, like Tim said, a handover, but that it has a plan. So that if you're relying on the GP to check up on something, that it's time bound. So this patient needs to be reviewed by the GP in 2 weeks in order to do what? and ideally, if you're thinking about it, and Chow-Yin and Tim can disagree with me because, of course, I'm not a doctor, but write it in a way the patient can understand what the plan is too, because they're getting a copy of their discharge summary, and in a resource-constrained environment where doctors are under the pump, having a patient who also understands, I've got to book to see my GP in 2 weeks because I've been given a new medicine and we need to check what it's doing. The GP will then need to refer me for another blood test to see whether the dose I am on might need to be adjusted. That's a plan that even a non-doctor like me can understand. So do, if you can find that little bit of extra time to have your discharge summary expressed in a way that it is a proper plan, and it's a plan that even the patient can understand, I think that would be great.
Oh, I think that's so important to involve the patient, to advise them. Do X blood test, make an appointment, see your GP to check that blood test once it's available, and then the GP has the information in front of them.
We often forget to think about the patient as part of the team, don't we?
That's right.
Whereas, in fact, they probably are perhaps the most important person in this whole equation. And some things will be dependent on their understanding and knowing what they need to do. So, if a GP gets a discharge summary saying see GP in 2 weeks, well, I can't, as a GP, make an appointment for that patient. So it is up to the patient to make the appointment to see me at a time that suits them, rather than at a time that I might happen to have free. Having said that, if it's really important, I think a GP might also put a reminder for themselves that if I haven't seen this patient in 2 weeks' time, I need to give them a call to remind them that actually this is fairly critical to have this review.
Yeah, absolutely. If the patient needs to be seen by another specialty team, I think at the time of the discharge, when you've got all the information to hand, it's a good time to make the referral. So you're not relying on the patient to go see their GP for the GP to then make the referral. If you're discharging them from your service, you have the information, I think it's a good time to prevent them from being lost to follow-up.
Yep, that's another gap that often emerges.
Yeah. All right, so that's what I had down. Did either of you want to make any other comments?
Mine perhaps is a little off topic, Chow-Yin, but it's a real moment starting out in the workforce and going into the medical profession. And one of the things that is probably well down people's lists when they're trying to adjust to a new workplace and read all sorts of workplace policies and learn how things work will be looking at the Medical Council website. But if you can put it on your list of things to do, it is where you will find the Medical Council's statements of professional standards. And they are documents that don't often get looked at because you're so busy learning by doing, like an apprenticeship. But if something goes wrong, suddenly they they have all of this relevance and importance. What's written in one of these professional standards will be what someone's saying was always expected of you, whether you knew it or not. So take a moment to go and look what's there, look what the standards are, and then when you've got a spare moment, pick them off and have a read of them, because it will be helpful, I think, for a long and happy career to get a sense of, okay, well, if things go wrong, what's the rule book that I'll be measured against? And that's where you'll find it. Medical Council website, click on professional standards and have a read. So that's my 2 cents worth from a legal perspective.
Very good advice. Very good advice.
No, I think this is always going to be a bit of a potpourri, isn't it, of
Yeah.
bits of advice, and there's a lot more that we could say. But hopefully it'll just give you enough things to think about. So before you do something that in retrospect didn't turn out so well, stop and think is always a wise plan.
Also very good advice. So this brings us to the end of our podcast. We wish you all a rewarding experience as you start out in medicine. Don't forget, if you've got any medico-legal questions, you're welcome to call us on our 0800 line. Otherwise, we look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast. If you like the Medical Protection podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org.